If you've ever felt unsure about what really sets Inktense apart from watercolor pencils, or if the differences even matter, this video is for you. Yes, Inktense are technically ink-based, not watercolor-based. And while that's often where the conversation stops, I want to go further. Because for those of us who actually paint with both, what matters isn't the formulation, it's how they behave on the page. Hi, I'm Françoise. Welcome back to my channel for watercolor pencil, and Inktense techniques. I'm going to use my Inktense pencils to paint this daisy, so let's jump right in. For the background, I've decided to use my favorite loose technique, one I've only shared with watercolor pencils so far. What I do, and you can see works just as well with Inktense pencils, if you already know the videos on my channel, is to grate pigment with sanding paper, and then I smooth it all out with a paper towel. It looks smooth, flawless, and beautiful, the whole point of this technique, especially if you don't have Inktense blocks. So far, so good. Then I activate parts of that background with a spray bottle on hot press paper for best results, since the paper dries faster than cold press and yields interesting patterns. The pigment spreads just as beautifully as it does with watercolor pencils. It blends well and even comes out looking a little more vibrant, which isn't surprising as enhanced colors is a known feature with Inktense pencils, hence their name. But then I noticed something I've seen before when using Inktense. Tiny blue specks of pigment have landed on lighter parts of the painting, and once they're there, they won't budge. With my watercolor pencils, this does not happen. The backgrounds always come out totally clean with this technique every time, even though the technique in itself is pretty messy. Pigment bits either completely dissolve or they just fly away. But somehow, Inktense are to be handled with a bit more care in that category. So here's the takeaway. Inktense can be a little messier. It is not a deal breaker, and it definitely did not ruin my piece, but it's something to keep in mind when working around clean whites or delicate areas. That's why with the swatch technique, another way to paint smooth background with watercolor pencils and water-soluble pencils, Inktense got me into the habit of wetting the palette first, so those pigment bits immediately melt on there and don't ever land on my paper to never go away after that. To protect the weight of the daisy petals and retain their shape, I find it easier to use masking fluid, something I do with my watercolor pencils often as well. Once removed, I noticed that Inktense tends to smudge more easily on those white areas, leaving behind very light blues, nothing bad, just again how slightly messier they can be. Now I actually don't mind this at all. It can work as a base layer for shadows, whites not being completely white anyways. But it's another moment where I realize how watercolor pencils give me slightly more control, especially when painting light or white subjects, like this rose that I painted and shared here on YouTube recently. Now when I deepen those shadows with blue and red, it's obvious that Inktense really packs a punch. Blue in particular explodes with intensity after activation. And that's not a problem, but it takes some extra water, blending, and patience to soften that. Watercolor pencils feel a bit more forgiving and predictable in these moments, even though blue in general overpowers other colors easily. So with Inktense, it's worth remembering and add those dark or overpowering colors little by little. So now the daisy petals are a bit bolder than intended, but there are several ways to fix that. The first tool I can think of to do this is an eraser. So on dry Inktense pigment areas that haven't been activated, it works great. But it doesn't work at all on areas where the pigment has already been activated and dried. In contrast, watercolor pencils can often be erased even after activation, which I love using for soft highlights. But here's a common Inktense myth I want to bust again. You can lift the paint even after it has been activated and dried when you use water, at least a little bit. I keep saying this in my videos simply because that's my experience with pretty much each painting. It might depend on your paper more than the pencils. Inktense paper, for example, is gonna make it harder to lift anything, I notice, but it's not the case with my usual hot press or cold press papers. To smooth the transition, another useful tool is a white pencil. I burnish the petals. It's an extra step, but it works beautifully to pull everything together. Before we move on, please tell me in the comments which one is your favorite. Is it Inktense or watercolor pencils? And then if you'd like to paint this along, you may join my Patreon and access a bunch of watercolor pencil and Inktense tutorials, or maybe just get ready to join my upcoming watercolor pencil course, because I might include a cool bonus about water-soluble pencils like Inktense, just a hint. And the best way to stay updated is to join my newsletter. Everything will be linked in the description below. Streaks are a pet peeve for many of us when we use anything that resembles a watercolor pencil, and that includes Inktense. And this wasn't a surprise to me, but it's still worth mentioning that when coloring directly onto paper, Inktense tends to be a bit streakier than the best watercolor pencils. Even though those pencils feel creamy and soft, it takes more effort to blend them into a smooth finish, as you can see here, from all the back and forth I'm doing, especially compared to the top tier watercolor pencils like my Faber-Castell Embrush Dur or Caran d'Ache Museum Aquarelle. Unless I use the graded pigment or swatch technique beforehand, some visible lines tend to stick around. They're not bad, but they're there. Also, I've noticed that the leads on Inktense break more easily than the high-end watercolor pencil brands. It is not a huge issue, just another point to be aware of. One thing that I absolutely love about Inktense pencils and I'm not finding in any water pencil sets that I own, the dark colors are truly deep, rich, and intense. With watercolor pencils, I often rely on water-soluble graphite to boost my shadows because blacks and deep colors can fall a little flat, and graphite works like a charm. But with Inktense, I found that it's not necessary. Here, I'm using a charcoal gray in the center of the flower, and that alone gives me amazing contrast and dimension. Something I love to do with watercolor pencils, and that works great with Inktense too, is to use the wet the lead technique. I do that with yellow here to add texture and create a beautiful 3D effect in that center. The vibrancy is just next level. But again, techniques and the way I use my pencils, whether it is Inktense or watercolor pencils, it's the same. White gouache is a plus here. It helps reshape some of the petals and up the whites a tad more. And here we go with this beautiful daisy. So I hope you've enjoyed this. Next, check out this watercolor pencil video for all the cool things you can do with a white pencil. And stay tuned here or join my email list for updates on my watercolor pencil course launch and a great deal coming up. Thank you for watching and see you next time.